All right, some breaking news on the controversial issue of voter fraud.
So there aren't that many instances of actual in-person voter fraud. So that's a tough thing for them to sort of make the argument about because it's happened extremely rarely. There are a few instances where it's usually actually family members impersonating someone else at the polls. There was a case where someone voted at their high school on behalf of their father in one instance. Just the idea that people go to polls to impersonate other people, that's not really how people typically would try to steal an election. And it's an extremely ineffective method because you have a number of ways you can get tripped up. There are times where someone at the polling station as a poll worker might already know the person who you're impersonating. So typically when people try to steal elections on a massive level, it's typically done via absentee fraud. But Republicans don't want to discourage absentee fraud because there's a belief that people who vote via the mail are more likely to vote for Republicans. So it probably wouldn't be great for their bottom lines. I think the media coverage of the Acorn scandal has played a big role in a lot of these laws being passed in the past couple of years. Certainly when you have stories about people registering as Mickey Mouse, that's something that raises a lot of attention. In a lot of these cases, they flagged instances where they thought they were of suspicious registrations, and just because Mickey Mouse was registered to vote didn't mean anyone actually showed up and voted on his behalf. It's sort of a case where there's just equating, voter registration fraud, which is a very specific type of election fraud, with in the larger pool of voter fraud, which people use to justify these voter ID laws.
And stealing your vote? Alarming reports of voter fraud are running rampant right now. Drug money even said to be involved.
Well, it's interesting because the states that really probably don't matter as much in, as far as aren't really up for grabs are the ones where the Justice Department has inserted themselves, specifically because they're covered by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which only is in effect for certain states with a history of racial discrimination. So they've inserted themselves in Texas and in South Carolina. They've also opened up an investigation in Pennsylvania, but that's going to be a little bit of a tougher legal hurdle for them to get over because it's not covered by Section 5. In Pennsylvania, obviously, it seems to be the one that's getting a lot of focus right now. There's, a large population, and it's a pretty strict photo identification law there. So there seems to be, especially in Philadelphia, obviously a highly Democratic area, a lot of people who don't have ID. There's going to be they're trying to educate people about it, of course, but that campaign is actually being run by a Republican lobbying company. So, there are questions about, and when you have someone out there saying, effectively that this is going to help Romney, a Republican leader saying that this is going to help Romney win the election, that doesn't help for any arguments that this isn't political.
Voter ID, which is going to allow Governor Romney to win the state of Pennsylvania. Done.
One of the most interesting things is that Pennsylvania admitted, yes, we have no examples of in-person voter fraud, and we don't expect there to be any in-person voter fraud if this law doesn't go into effect, which is pretty big, admission. So it sort of, questions why would you need to pass this law in the first place if you're admitting it wasn't a problem. It's a Republican judge who upheld it, and it's because the Supreme Court is balanced between 3-3 tie right now. It's probably likely to be upheld, and this will be in effect for in November. Democrats think that a lot of their core constituents who they count on for turnout every year, including young people, the elderly, minorities, the poor, are all going to be directly impacted by these laws. There's plenty of statistics to back that up. When you compare the number of registered voter in a number of these states, including in South Carolina and Texas, when you compare the number of registered voters without photo ID, minorities are a lot less likely to have state-issued form of photo identifications. And it's very tough to reach a lot of these communities. For one example, in Pennsylvania, actually, they have a list of their Hall of Fame voters, who are voters who have voted in the past 50 elections. And I called a number of them, and I spoke to one Romney supporter, an elderly woman who thought that she would be able to vote this year and wasn't. And she, she said, "Yes, I have a driver's license." And then I asked her, if she could perhaps tell me when it expired, and it turned out that it expired a few years ago. So, and she wasn't aware of that. So now she's going to have to she's going to have to take time to go get a new form of ID.
Drug dealers buying votes to steal elections.
Voter ID supporters have very strong talking points on this matter. They say, you need a voter ID to get on a plane, you need a voter ID to get a beer. So they sort of talk about this issue on a broader level that sort of, and people pick that up, and that, makes a lot of sense to people. Oh, if I needed to do that, these things I needed to do, I needed to vote. Some people don't realize necessarily that actually you can get on a plane without an ID. You just have to submit to a perhaps a little closer screening, and they would, look individually at you and probably be able to look you up in a database.
Disturbing new reports that voter fraud is rampant in Kentucky.
What a lot of the groups that are opposing voter ID are trying to do is educate people just about what types of specific identification they require. It's not just any ID that will work. For example, especially for college students who moved from out of town in Wisconsin, for example, a lot of college students who want to vote in Wisconsin have out-of-state driver's licenses, which are obviously great forms of photo identification, but won't be accepted under the law because it is very specific to Wisconsin. So in order to vote in Wisconsin, you would have to get a driver's license, in order to vote in Wisconsin, you would either have to get a free photo identification, or you'd have to pay money to get a in-state driver's license. So it's effectively a poll tax, because in order to keep your right to drive and vote and not just pick one or the other, you have to pay a fee.
Voter fraud is a reality of our time, as I think Wisconsin voters are aware.
One of my favorite stories in the last few months with voter fraud was a case where there was a local news report about a dog being registered to vote. And it was this anonymous man who was in the park playing with his dog, and the station granted him anonymity. And it later turns out that actually, the person who registered their dog was married to a Republican staffer on a New Mexico Senate campaign. So it sort of became, of course, an issue for the campaign, and he had to put out a statement, saying that his wife had no knowledge of this. But it's, as I think in this case, as you see with a lot of the, involvement that James O'Keefe has had in these videos, a lot of these examples of potential in-person voter fraud of actually they're just setups by certainly people with an interest in this, and an interest in promoting this. I guess the myth you would call it, that there's a lot of in-person voter fraud. The idea that that people actually do this when you're risking a 5-year prison sentence it just doesn't happen. There's a very high risk to a very low reward scenario. In order to actually steal an election, you have to know how many votes you're going to need to steal to do it effectively. Yeah. So, the idea that you're going to have a lot of different people going in and pretending to be other people is, it's extremely risky. It's almost guaranteed that something goes wrong. That's why we've seen no massive scale of anyone doing that.
What's the incentive?
Right.
It's so.
Yep.